Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here today to speak to you about a subject which is of great interest to me, that's iron making. I have for many years in central Pennsylvania have been one of the leading iron makers with the Freedom Iron Works that we own near Lewistown, Pennsylvania. It's a very extensive works, and we make a lot of railroad products, tires for locomotives, wheels for the cars, axles, pistons and pump rods, springs, and all kinds of parts for the railroad industry. For many years, pretty much for much of my adult life, I have been involved in various aspects of iron making and railroads. To let you know, back a few years ago, about 1838, fresh out of Dickinson College, I became enamored with railroad, being a civil engineer by trade. Of course, railroads at that time were just beginning to be built in America. There were only a few operating. And one of my first jobs was to help to survey a potential rail line across the state of Pennsylvania under the direction of Heather Hage, who had been directed to perform that. Well, Heather tried to please too many people, and instead of putting the railroad where it logically should go, it kind of wove around every town that tried to lobby to get the railroad to come to it. So the legislature wisely decided not to follow that plan. So for the next several years, I spent some time surveying other railroads. For instance, the Central Railroad of Georgia helped to survey part of that, where I met and befriended another engineer who, I don't know if you know, G. Edgar Thompson, and he and I became good friends. Well, coming back to Pennsylvania by the mid-1840s, the idea of a cross-state railroad line was again coming into vogue, and I was again a part of that. This time, I was asked to help to form the founding board of directors of what became the Pennsylvania Central Railroad, which was chartered in the mid-1840s. It didn't take long for us to start building westward, and while we were building towards Lewistown, there was an ironworks that was there that came up for sale, and I thought this would be a good opportunity to not only go into this venture, but also to supply the railroad with the iron it needed to build westward. So through the sheriff's sale of that property, my family and I acquired it, and we enlarged it, expanded it, and today it is one of the largest works in the state and produces a lot of railroad products, as I've said. We used a lot of this to build westward towards Hollidaysburg and on to Pittsburgh. And while we were building there, of course, we needed a rail center to help to cross the Allegheny Mountains. And again, I was instrumental in helping to found the city of Altoona, which is that rail center that we built in order to do that. So I come to you with a lot of expertise in iron making and in railroads. But what I was really asked to talk about today is a little bit about the condition of iron making in Pennsylvania. My expertise is, of course, in the Juniata Valley. And I'm sure you, as everyone know, the Juniata Valley is very famous for its iron. Maybe you don't know that. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So the Juniata Valley itself was opened up for settlement in the 1860s. And some of the first settlers started to report some iron ore deposits in the area, and that led to some Philadelphia iron masters becoming curious and sending expeditions into the valley. One of the ones that's recorded was the Juniata Iron Company, which came in and made surveys and found good quantities of excellent iron ore for iron making. However, before anything could be done with these surveys, the American Revolution took place, and it wasn't until 1785 that the first ironworks would actually be built in the Juniata Valley. And it was built in what is now Huntingdon County. And for the next several years, several other ironworks were located there. And by about the time of the end of the War of 1812, the Juniata Valley had become the principal iron-producing district of the United States. Now, how did that happen? Well, these iron ores were found to be of very excellent quality, even better than the initial surveys indicated. We had vast expanses of hardwood forests and excellent limestone. All things you need to make good iron. You need a good fuel. And of course, in those days, charcoal was the only fuel that was available. Although in England, they started to utilize coal for iron production, in England, the coals were very soft and could easily be made into coke. Here, the anthracite coal that was being found in northeastern Pennsylvania, you simply could not turn it into coke. It simply was too hard. Not only that, trying to smelt iron with it, it just simply could not get enough heat value out of it in order to do that. So anthracite just really wasn't a usable fuel for iron making until the development of the hot blast furnace in the 1830s. With that, it led to the ability to utilize anthracite coal for iron production. And once that happened, larger and larger furnaces could be built. In the meantime, in western Pennsylvania, the bituminous coals, the soft coals have been found, and these were able to be converted into coke. Now, initially, they thought they could just simply use the coal straight on to make iron, and they made a little bit of iron with it, but the bituminous coals, unfortunately, had too much sulfur in them, and therefore did not make good iron. So in the coking process, they were able to eliminate a lot of that sulfur. And coke is expected to become the dominant fuel throughout the remaining part of the 19th century. Even in central Pennsylvania, there were some small coal deposits, mostly in Bedford County and such, that were still able to be converted into coke and still usable as a fuel. But charcoal really was the fuel of choice here in America because we had the hardwood to sustain it. Well, really what happens is that after the introduction of coal as a fuel into the furnaces, something else remarkable happened. It is seen that charcoal iron produced a far superior product, far superior iron, than anything that could be made with coals at the time. And this helped to sustain the Juniata Valley for many years. Although in later years some would convert to coal, a lot of them would not, would remain charcoal fuel. And by the time the railroads started being built, railroads would not buy anything other than charcoal iron for their product because of its quality. So the Juniata Valley really, with all this excellent resource, becomes a great iron-making area. And even as early as 1800, the quality of Juniata iron was really starting to be realized. And it was starting to be compared to some of the finest irons in the world. You know, at that time, if you wanted to buy the best iron you could buy, it would come from Norway, Sweden, or Russia. Well, here was a new product right out of America, we call Juniata iron, that was considered to be equal, and in some cases, even superior to the finest irons of the world. And of course, when you're doing that, everybody wants to get in on it, right? So what happens is that a lot of people, a lot of iron masters come into the Juniata Valley and start to build, and the reputation grows and grows. So as I said, by about the end of the War of 1828, the War of 1812, the Juniata Valley has become the principal iron producing district in the United States. And it would continue to grow. By the year 1828, the Juniata Valley was producing about 48% of the iron produced in Pennsylvania. That's a significant number. We're producing all but half. And that 48% statewide equated to 20% of the national output at the time. So out of every 5 tons of iron made, 1 of them came from the Juniata Valley. The wealth of the Juniata Valley iron would help to establish the Pittsburgh rolling mills, because the iron was initially made and smelted in the Juniata Valley, shipped westward to Pittsburgh, where it was then refined and rolled into product. And fully 40 to 60%, depending on the time period, of iron used in Pittsburgh's mills came from the Juniata Valley at this time. So you can see the market is growing for this. But it was very hard to get this iron over the mountain. We had the Pennsylvania Mainline Canal in 1834 when it finally was completed. And it was a marvel in its day because it cut transportation time. You know, think about it, in the early days of Pennsylvania, it took 21 days to travel from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. You know, it took fully about a week and a half to 2 weeks to ship heavy iron over the mountains because it was a grueling process to put it on pack animals And it took a lot to get it there. With the opening of the canal, it made it easy. From Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, it cut 21 days down to 7 days. So, still, quicker, but we needed better. When the railroads came in, it would cut it down to a few hours of transport. And not only that, the railroad didn't freeze in the wintertime. You know, the canals in Pennsylvania in the wintertime, they shut down because you couldn't transport because the canals would freeze. So the railroads were able to operate year-round. And that's why railroads, you know, in my view, were far superior to canals for transporting those kind of products. Because they could do it easier, quicker, and more economically. Well, we are now looking at a change in the industry here in the 1850s. We're starting to see shifts. Junior iron, while it's still holding its reputation, now starts to be overtaken by anthracite. This is iron made up in northeastern Pennsylvania. By 1855, the Juniata Valley would no longer be the principal iron producing district. So I think for about almost 40 years, the Juniata Valley could claim that crown. It shifted up to the Lehigh Valley because the anthracite furnaces could be made bigger. A lot of that had to do with the technological limit of the product. Charcoal is a rather soft product. So when you start putting it into the furnace and dumping heavy layers of iron ore and limestone in it, it starts to crush the powder if you put too much weight on it. Well, coal, of course, being harder, can support a lot more weight. So where a charcoal furnace can, most average charcoal furnace produce about 4 to 5 tons of iron every day. An anthracite furnace can probably produce 30 to 50 tons a day. However, remember what I said, it could not match the quality. Although it outpaced it in quantity of iron produced, it couldn't outmatch it in quality. So your railroad builders, like Baldwin, refused to buy anything but charcoal iron to make locomotives and parts. So what happens now is that charcoal iron has a steady market in the expansion of the railroads. So where you would normally think, well, it's anthracite iron's cheaper and easier to make, and you make more of it, charcoal iron naturally would be tossed off. Charcoal iron remained as a steadfast product, increasingly being absorbed by the railroad industry. Let the normal iron objects be made by anthracite iron and even coke iron. Charcoal becomes the dominant iron in the iron industry. Now, another criticism of the charcoal industry, which is interesting, is that the hot blast came in with anthracite, which allowed it to be made. So a lot of people would think, well, why don't we just adopt it to the charcoal industry? You know, we can maybe make more iron with less fuel and maybe increase production. Well, it didn't really work out that way because of the economies of it. But what really happened is that we learned that the hot blast method in charcoal iron somehow changed the chemical makeup of the iron, and it didn't work and made a poor quality iron. So charcoal remained, for the most part, what we now call a coal blast operation. And I've heard a lot of iron historians today criticize that the charcoal industry for failing to modernize it and innovate. They did. We did. I tried it. It didn't work. You know? And if you're going to sell iron, what are you going to sell? What sells and what doesn't sell? You know? So we actually now have a term for it. We now call it chilled iron. And increasingly, chilled iron is the favorite iron to make railroad wheels for passenger cars and railroads. Yeah, there's no other iron or steel around that can beat that. Now, as we move into close to the War of the Rebellion period, as we call it in my day, I know you call it the Civil War today. In my day, we called it the War of the Rebellion, at least in the North we did. In England, there's a new process for refining iron. And the original concept was to take malleable iron, what we call wrought iron, and to improve its quality. and to make it more easily and cheaply. See, wrought iron, wrought means to hammer, so that type of iron has to be hammered. And it's very labor intensive. So if we can find a way to make larger quantities of it easier and cheaper, we're certainly going to look that way. And there was a young man who did figure out a way of doing this. And he learned to do it without using any fuel in the process. However, by a fate of history, when he did his initial experiments, they worked beautifully. But as he started to sell off franchises to it, nobody else could seemingly reproduce his iron. Well, unfortunately, he didn't get very far with this revolutionary process. Most men would have probably just said, oh, well, it didn't work, I'll go on to something else. But this young man was determined, why did it work for anyone else when it worked so beautifully for him? So he starts experimenting around, and he suddenly finds the culprit in it. Just by a fate of history, the iron ore that he obtained to make the iron to make his initial experiments happened to be iron that had no phosphorus in it. Just by dumb luck. Where most of the ores of England, and is also true in the United States, a lot of the ores have phosphorus in it. Phosphorus was the culprit that wouldn't allow it to make good iron. So he figures it out. You need to do this. But how do you eliminate phosphorus from the iron? You know, we got two alternatives. Use only iron ore that has no phosphorus in it, which there isn't very much, or find a way to neutralize the phosphorus. Well, there's another man who he got the secret off of, and this other man would later become part of another method of iron making, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But he discovered by adding manganese to the iron, it counteracted the phosphorus. So he now had the secret to making this good iron. However, the iron masters were done with it. Well, not to be outdone, he decides to try another route. Up in the Sheffield area of England is the great steelmaking center that's been there for a couple of centuries. Steel was around. It was a metal from ancient times. One of the most famous steels in history was the Damascus steel, which made swords and such. But steel was very labor intensive, even more so than wrought iron. It was very labor intensive to make. Had to be hammered repeatedly and welded to drive out the impurities until you got a good product. So what they were looking for was a way of making more of it easily and cheaply. Well, they latched on to this process, and it worked for them. Well, this young man, the process would become named after him, and I'm sure you know it today. This young man's name who had developed this process was Henry Bessemer. So now Henry had the product figured out. The steelmakers of England now have adopted it, and Sheffield becomes a great, famous center of steelmaking. With the vessel where they would put virgin liquid iron into it, blow air through it from underneath to burn out the impurities in the spectacular showers furnace. I have visited those great works in Sheffield, and I've seen it for myself. Well, now, Henry wants to bring it to the Americans. So he brings it over here. He brings this process over and patents it in the United States. Well, it so happened that there was another man in the United States, his name was William Kelly, who quite independently had pretty much figured out much the same thing and had experimented with it. And it's debatable whether he had total success or not. But when he heard about Bessemer, he instantly filed patent suits against him. And the two fought like brothers for years. For almost 10 years, Bessemer was locked out of the American iron industry. So there were other people and manufacturers looking at ways around it in order to make this. Because Kelly you couldn't buy a Kelly patent because he didn't have all the patents. He got half the patents roughly. Bessemer got the other half. And you needed all of them in order to make it. Because Kelly did not go the full route that Bessemer did. So in order to make Bessemer steel or Kelly steel, you needed all of the patents. And that wasn't going to happen, at least for a while. So anyway, while I was, of course, with the railroad, I befriended another young telegrapher who was investing in many things, and he was enamored of these new processes, but again, was frustrated that we could not bring it to America. So he starts to work with some other processes of steelmaking that were developed in England just around the time of Bessemer, were abandoned because of the Bessemer process. And he bought into my plant and became the principal investor in my plant around 1860. And the idea was that we put in a rail mill and we would roll iron rails. And then with one of these two processes from England, we would take it and re-roll them to make steel heads out of them, converting the iron heads into steel. Well, didn't work very well. Tried to tell my friend that he sold all this to the Pennsylvania Railroad, and it was nothing but junk. While the heads of the rails were fine, the web of it, the vertical part between the head and the base, did not last in this process. So we were kind of frustrated. Well, after the war, Alexander Hawley up in New England, up in New York, finally got a group of investors together and decided they were going to finally bring a Bessemer to America. So they went to Kelly and they went to Bessemer independently and were able to buy up their patent rights and were able to franchise it and finally bring Bessemer to America. And we were elated at our point, because now we would have the ability to finally do what we wanted to do, expand into the new market of rail. See, the railroad started importing Bessemer rails from England and found them far superior to anything the Americans were making, because they were harder and more durable. So we wanted to get on the business. So I went to England, studied the process in Sheffield, that's when I was there, and purchased a plant and brought it back, and we installed in what became the third operational Bessemer works in the United States. It's located outside of Lordstown, central Pennsylvania. And my friend was very much a part of it. Well, we thought we had it made. You know, we were going to make good iron. We made the best iron in the world. We're going to make the best steel in the world. Well, of course, fates of history don't always favor everyone. And unfortunately, we ended up making a few critical flaws. One of them was that we did not fully understand the chemistry of iron. See, the chemistry of metals was just being born at this time. And some professors at universities were just starting to understand that chemistry would play a lot in the role of making good iron and good steel. So what made good iron did not make good steel. Our steel was brittle. And we worked and worked to try to figure it out. Finally calling in a professor from Yale University. And he was unable to help us to figure out what was wrong here. Well, I made a few other flaws. One of them is that instead of hiring workers out of England, I should have brought some workers back with me. I let my own little workers work this new fangled process. And nobody understood it. So that was a critical flaw. We also underestimated the amount of capital that we needed to do this until we could get it working and all the bugs out. And of course, the creditors came knocking at the door. And after a year, things finally went belly up. And fortunately, at that time, you know, the company was so upset with me about this, they kicked me out of it. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. So the Bessemer plant that we put in was a big failure. And the plant would be sold off, and it would go under actually not one, but two new groups of investors. It would be split into two companies and run for many more years as these two separate companies. Well, one of my friends, well, you notice I didn't mention his name either. And there's a reason for that. Well, you see, a couple years after this disaster, my friend himself visited those great Bessemer works at Sheffield. And he realized what we had done wrong. He came back and went to Pittsburgh and founded one of the greatest steel empire in the world at the time. I'm sure you know his name now. Carnegie, right? Andrew Carnegie. Yeah. A lot of people think, that people like Carnegie are always a success, that anything they touch is an instant success. No. Carnegie tried Bessemer and it failed. Yes. Well, sometimes I said those things happen. But anyway, the company that I worked with for many years, as I said, split into new companies. One of them, called the Logan Iron and Steel Company, would remain in business up until the end of World War II. And it would become one of the last true wrought iron producers in the United States. The other company was started by a man by the name of William Butcher. Anyone heard of William Butcher? Well, in England, there's a famous William Butcher. In essence, the English William Butcher is their Andrew Carnegie. He was the steel king in England. He and his brother Samuel had developed processes of crucible steelmaking and made a lot of things like straight razors and such. And they had even done some investing in America. Well, in the 1860s, supposedly William Butcher Jr. was brought over, and he helped to set up the steel plant at Steelton, Pennsylvania, outside of Harrisburg. Before he went to Philadelphia, he founded what became the William Butcher Steel Works. But they said he was a good steelmaker, but not a good businessman. And it kind of went bankrupt, and he was forced out of it. That plant would be reorganized and become the famous Midvale Steel Works. Well, he comes to our plant in Lewiston and brings 40 workers with him and founds William Butcher Company and starts making crucible steel there. But again, he becomes financially embarrassed and disappears out of the record about 1873. The creditors seized his plant and operated for a couple of years until the principal creditor decides to buy out the others and take over the plant. And this creditor was Baldwin Locomotive. In 1875, they took over the plant, created it as a subsidiary of Baldwin Locomotive, and it became renamed Standard Steel Works. I can say that although Baldwin is long gone, Standard Steel is still in business today, still making railroad products, and is the oldest continuously operating iron and steel forging works in the United States. For you see, I didn't found the Freedom Iron Company, I really bought it. And the company's history can be traced all the way back to a pioneer forge in 1790. Yes. And how many other famous steelwork can you think of that can brag that they have the latest steelmaking process in one building, and the building right beside it was using water wheel powered trip hammers, a technology that was centuries old? So anyway, the Juniata Valley continued on for many years, supplying iron to this increasing railroad industry and also to the steel industry. Furnaces, though, would start to shut down because the big critical thing was running out of wood. It took an acre force every day to feed a charcoal furnace. That's a lot of wood when you think about it. And perhaps it was the most labor-intensive part of the process of these furnaces was to make the charcoal. And coal was much easier. However, what saved charcoal iron from dying in the mid-19th century, you remember what I said about its quality? And this Bessemer steel, and then later, Openhurst steel. Remember I said the gentleman who would be part of another process that Bessemer got the manganese secret off of? His name was Mouchet, and he was one of the three co-founders of what became known as the Openhurst process of steel. And Openhurst would eventually supply Bessemer as they dominant steelmaking before. But steel, although increasingly was taking over products formerly made of iron, one product that they could not make that would match the quality of charcoal iron for nobody else for railroad passenger cars. And that became the last great product of charcoal iron in America. It wasn't until the 1920s that steel alloy was developed to replace charcoal iron. And when that happened, the charcoal iron industry quietly died in the mid-1920s. But if you would look at the records, I can tell you, you wouldn't know that, because if you, like, say, look in 1900, charcoal iron accounts for less than 2% of the iron and steel produced in the United States. Do you think charcoal iron's on its way out in 1900? Well, you would think so, looking at that, but you gotta look at the numbers behind it. Well, you see in 1900, the actual tonnage of charcoal iron made was greater than at any time in the 19th century. It's just that steel was so eclipsing it, it made it such a significant part. So charcoal iron did enjoy this brief period where it remained a superior product for one major thing. Well, today when you travel around, these old charcoal furnaces seem like relics as distant as dinosaurs. One of the ones that I own today is today a nice park and such. And we'll talk about that. But anyway, that is my role in Central Pennsylvania's iron steel making in the Now I'm going to break character. Do you want to introduce me now?
Yes.
I had her introduce me in my character name rather than my real name. You may have thought, well, it said a different name on the advertisement. So I was actually in character. I'm going to take this jacket off. We get a little
warm. My name is Darla Gill, and I'm an employee of the library.